Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here once again. My name is Umnia, and I'm the Managing Director of Brussels Global. I also create lots of content on social media, talking about Africa and geopolitics, but for like Gen Z and millennials. And today's session is going to be about emerging Africa. So the way it's going to go is quite simple. We're going to have this panel discussion with all these people around me that I'm going to introduce in a second. And it's going to last about an hour 15. And after this, you guys will have the chance to ask all the questions that you want. There will be like 20 minutes, 30 minutes of Q&As. So please feel free to ask them the hard questions. Don't hesitate. So yeah, let me tell you a little bit more about the session, and then I'll be introducing the panelists one by one. So today we're going to be talking about shaping a new era of trade and investments in a troubled world. It sounds a bit complicated, so I'll simplify it for you. So as you must or maybe don't know, Africa today is home to the youngest and fastest growing population in the world. By 2050, we'll have around 800 million people added to the workforce. So this is huge. And this means that these people need jobs and that the economy has to obviously improve. The problem is that despite, you know, this amazing news that we have so many young, smart people on the continent, the economic growth of Africa with the global recession of this year has been declining. It's estimated to be 3.3% GDP in the whole of Africa. There are, of course, some exceptions on the continent because Africa is a very big place. There are some countries that are growing, I believe, Congo, Mozambique, Senegal. We have actually nobody from these countries here, but we have people from other countries that are very interesting. Another point that I want you guys to know is that the private sector in Africa is really emerging. There are currently 345 companies in Africa that have a revenue of over $1 billion. So this is huge, and these companies are growing. Yeah, so in today's panel, we're going to try to figure out how can we increase, improve trade and investment on the continent. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists today, starting with Toysine. She's right there. So she's the founder of Money Africa. They're huge on Instagram, if you guys want to check them out. So it's an edtech community helping Africans become financially independent. Very, very important. We also have on the panel Ewan Cameron, who's a Scottish person but living in South Africa because he's in charge of Westmont Hospitality Group. It's a family office that basically has grown to oversee over 1,000 hotels across the world in the 4 continents, and in Africa they are present in Morocco, of course, Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Mozambique. So he knows a lot about real estate and investing, you know, in properties and things like that. We also have my friend Antonio da Silva, who's from Angola. So he's the founder of Invest A Consultancy. He knows a lot about trade and investment. He used to be in charge of the agency for investments in Angola. Very, very smart guy. He also has very good content on LinkedIn, if you want to check him out. We also have, so Etienne Giraud on his right side. By the name, you can tell that he's a French person, but he's also in charge of the, it's called, in French, I'll say it's Conseil Français des Investisseurs en Afrique, which is basically the French Council for French investors in Africa. So, yeah. And then we have Liban Soleiman, right there, in black, looking very serious. So he's a former chief of staff in Gabon, and he knows a lot about investing in Africa. He also worked for the Rwanda Development Board. Very knowledgeable, smart guy as well. And I have two more people to introduce, so they're also very interesting. On my left side, we have Mr. Arkebe, who is a former senior minister and special advisor to the Prime Minister in Ethiopia. Ethiopia, which for the past 10 years has been one of the highest growing countries in Africa. They've had a huge GDP growth. And then last but not least, my Nigerian brother right there, who is Ekenem, am I saying it right? Yeah. Managing partner of ACIOE Associates. They basically work on many advisory projects on digital transformation, healthcare. They advise governments in many African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, etc. So before I start asking questions, I want to ask you guys, how many of you have been to any of the African countries that my fellow speakers are from? None. Great. So you're going to be learning a lot today. Awesome. So I'm going to start the panel, and I would like to ask you all, please, panelists, to speak between 5 minutes, maximum 6 minutes each, and to make it as interactive as possible. Before you speak, you just want to press on this button here until it becomes red, because otherwise people can't hear you. So let's start with Toisin. So I want to ask you from your perspective, since you create a lot of educational content and you're in touch with younger generations, what kind of trends do you see as being the most promising to increase trade between African countries?
So in terms of the trend that I'm saying that looks like the most promising in terms of trade is actually, surprisingly, it's actually migration, right? We've seen lots and lots of young people migrating. Now, the question is, how can we get them to migrate to other parts of Africa? Why does it have to be outside of Africa? What are the opportunities in Rwanda? What are the opportunities in Nairobi? They want a different environment. They want to experience something new. How are you making these other places attractive for them? Why can't somebody leave Lagos to go work in Cape Town, or somebody go work in Nairobi, amongst others? So that's the trend I'm saying. So how can we keep that trend on the continent? Because what's happening is we're seeing a brain drop. We're literally seeing us losing those talents. So if we want to keep that trade in Africa, they want to migrate, they want to move, they don't want to stay in the same city they grew up in, that they have all their friends, they want to migrate. How do you make other African cities attractive enough to them and for them to be able to do that? Now, another thing as well is when we're talking about collaboration, we want to work amongst each other. So there's a designer in Nairobi, there's a designer in Ghana. How do we work together? How do you make it easy? Let me give you an example. I got into Stanford Seed and I was in Ghana for a program. I forgot my dollar card in Lagos. And it was a nightmare having to make a transaction. I literally had to go through a very, very hard process in order to make a transaction. How can we make payments easy, that it's not a nightmare for that to happen? So if you're trying to push trade, you also have to look at the ease of people moving around, and the ease of them making that payment is also very, very important. So these are the trends that I'm seeing with regards to trade and investment, especially for young people in the continent.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I would like to ask Liban, because you do travel a lot. You know, you are based in Dubai, but you travel all over Africa. So do you agree with what she just said? And also, how do you think we can make African people want to work in other African countries versus migrating to Europe?
So I don't know if you can hear me. Maybe there's a problem with the sound.
can
Right?
hear
I
you.
couldn't. Yeah. Okay. No, I would like to start by saying with the theme of the panel that we start maybe by saying that there's a saying in Africa that says whether elephants fight or make love, it's always the grass that suffers, right? And the unity of elephants, you know, is a little bit of the dynamic of this, planet that we see where now today as Africans, what we forgot to do is become a herd of buffaloes to protect our savannah. And what I would like to start by what she stated, it starts also by congratulating progressive leadership that has decided to stop visa travels throughout the continent. You look today, countries like Rwanda in 2018, Seychelles, Benin, and now recently Kenya announced a visa-free policy for Africans in Africa. So it starts from that level and then granulates into the movement of goods, people, and services. So I completely agree with Tosin, and we take it even beyond that by looking at what's going on with our different financial systems, right? Whether it be financial centers. Today, as an African, of course, I'm a former PEP, so my case is particular, but for an African, opening a bank account anywhere in the world is a hassle. There's a total discrimination. Until we build our own financial systems, until we start creating trade flows within the continent where cash is moving, because financial systems are based on corridors of capital, right? So if money moves in one direction, it's easier to get money sent to that direction. And I think that the elements that you're talking about, we've done some major progress. I'm also involved with an initiative called Future Africa, where we are partners with the founder of Flutterwave and many other fintechs I'm on the board of. And you look at the interoperability that is happening now, where Africa is making huge bounds in terms of financial inclusion and remittance systems. So I think once we overlay these different systems, and I know he has way more knowledge on that than I do, but entities like InterSwitch, entities like today MFS, who have succeeded with the mobile money systems to allow transfer of funds throughout. I know that the Central Africa region has started a movement with something called GMAC, which allows every financial system to be interconnected. So once we do that, I think it evolves. And last but not least, I would like to say that until we talk about movement and migration of people, I know that you have been a head of the investment promotion agency. I have too. At the beginning, I used to dream that we fly around the world and we get investors to come and build real estate and hotels. But when you look at Dubai, the three biggest real estate developers are Emaar, Damak, and Miraz. So it's an endogenous movement of investment until we create the ecosystems that will allow to host properly our different migrants, workers. You look at today the number of developers in Africa. They have nowhere to go remotely work from. They rather go to Dubai or to the US and so on. So I think that there are certain elements for sedentarization that have to do with ecosystem development, quality of life, and movement of flows. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to ask Ewan to pick up on that, because you did mention that your work really helps investors build a base in different African countries, which then helps grow trade and investment. So could you expand on that, please?
Thank you, and thanks so much.
Could you please be closer to the mic? Yeah, thank
sorry.
you.
Maya, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be at MEDays 2023. Maybe if I can just explain who Westmont is. Westmont, as you said, is a family fund. It's originally from Uganda and then re-established in Canada, and over the last 40 years has grown to be one of the largest private owners of hotel real estate, deploying their own capital and also with other institutional style investing. Within Morocco, we've been active in Morocco since about 2010. We have 3 businesses here. We have a steel business, we own the Four Seasons in Marrakesh, and we've recently just finished the refurbishment of what was the Sheraton. It's now the Marriott Hotel, in Casablanca. So to your question, we're looking quite clearly at what the consumer demand curve is in the continent. So if you take, for instance, a city such as Lagos, which Tunisia knows well, there is a disproportionately high domestic spendability in that market. Sometimes it's even under-recorded with regard to GDP figures. And famously, you know, 5 years ago, we did a repositioning with regard recalculation of Nigeria's GDP, and it then moved from being number 2 to being number 1, because we still have a lot of informal elements of particularly the Nigerian economy. So I think there's limitations about movement of capital across borders. I think there's sometimes challenges with regard to accessing debt, particularly if you look at how African households, and it's terrible to generalize, if you take somewhere like Kenya, for instance, there's been a huge growth in residential new developments, to your point, but actually raising the debt to buy those is problematic. It's hard to get a bond or get a mortgage in many of these African markets, particularly in Kenya. So what's happened? The real estate market's moved, shifted a bit, and is now opening up to more rental structures to allow Kenyans to then get on the property ladder and have a quality home. And that, to me, is a good example of where opportunity is. If you look in Nigeria, with regard to the fact, as your point was absolutely well taken, with regard to transfer of funds. Now, one of the largest incomes into Africa is actually from this diaspora. What's actually been generated by Nigerians internationally, and that money coming back into Nigeria, you can track those numbers, and again, as an investor, that's interesting to us with regard to where those growth opportunities are with regard to that domestic economy. Here in Morocco, I think I would say there's 3 big things that I would say that the Moroccan leadership has put together, which allows me as an international investor to be confident investing here in Morocco. One is currency risk. Currency risk is very well managed within Morocco with regard to the fact that it's tied effectively to a basket between the euro and the dollar. So that means that my risk of bringing foreign currency into the market is reduced. Secondly, there's a very transparent and robust legal system. You have good confidence the fact that when you invest in Morocco, your assets are owned, they're recorded, and there's clear transparency. Sometimes my fellow investors get frustrated about the rules and the regulations in Morocco. I actually think that's the benefit of Morocco. I think that transparency and that licensing structure is a strong attribute. And the third thing, and please do not underestimate this, is leadership. The Moroccan government and King Mohammed VI have been very articulate about what the future of Morocco is going to look like. Quite often in the continent we talk a lot about the past. Morocco spends most of its time, I think, talking about the future. And I would give you 2 very strong examples of that. One, obviously, is FIFA 2030. And
yes, let's, you know, clap for this.
that is, I love football. My boys play football relentlessly. But actually, the real big catalyst of growth that 2030 brings is the fact that as an investor, you have our investment horizon. We have some urgency. There's a big global event. 101 football matches will be shared between Spain, Portugal, and Morocco. That's going to put those countries very much at the focal point of the globe at that point in time. And it means in investment terms, there is a big activity that happens in 2030. It sets urgency, it sets pace, and it sets focus. And the other big vision that I would say that King Mohammed VI has brought is he's just established these initiatives with regard to the thermal funds. So these are themed investment funds where the King Mohammed VI has specified 6 sectors that he wants to actively encourage investments within the Morocco environment. And that to me is a great example of taking domestic capital, linking that with international capital to then be a catalyst for the entrepreneurial spirit of Moroccans to take advantage from. So I'll leave it at that point. But that's,
yeah, thank you. The Moroccans are very happy with what you said. So I want to bring the conversation back to more traditional trade and investment, as in which industries are actually needed, which industries do we need to focus on in Africa in order to boost the economic recovery of the continent. So I'm going to ask Antonio, because I know that you've dealt with so many investors in Angola, but also across the continent. So, and you were also in charge of a trade zone, a free trade zone, so you do know a lot about that.
Yeah, thank you, Omnia. First of all, I would like to say that I'm very happy to be again in Tangier. I was here last year, and it's definitely a place to be at this time of the year. So, as you have mentioned already, since we look at Africa more from a perspective of potential, effective potential across the continent, where countries have different levels of achieved development, and that same development needs to be backed up by reforms. Those reforms, as we see it in Angola, had to focus primarily in getting the function of state to be run and ruled as with transparency, and that was one of the priorities of the current government of President João Lourenço, tackling corruption. We have done that at such a point where almost anyone or no one is meant to be left over if wrongdoing is proven as having taken place. So regarding what we need to do in terms of boosting our economy through industries like transformative ones, agriculture has a lot of potential, and through the integration that's ongoing, we also think that in a collaborative manner, instead of doing the full value chain within our borders, we can also bring raw materials from other countries. We are doing this currently with the corridor of Lobito, which is intended to bring raw materials from neighboring Congo into Angola, and instead to be exported just like raw materials to transform that same raw material within the country. For that, of course, we need to have a grid or electrical sources of energy capable to support such activities, and also we need to have in place skilled workforce. So that's one of the challenges, again, that we can see it from a collaborative perspective. Instead of relying only on local or regional workforce, we can start looking around Africa and find those that are skilled, those that have the drive to travel across the continent to make money, of course, as one of the drives that anyone has, and also to see the promotion of growth in a way that gives chances to less developed countries in the continent. Overall, I think that the convergence that we are seeing now around the continent on the efforts of establishing a more friendly environment, it's a sign that we are more and more aware of our own potential and how we can together build a future where most of the 70% of Africans are less than 25 years, which means that huge potential. So by 2050, 1/3 of the population of the world is going to be for Africa. So when you project that from a perspective of consumer perspective, you can see how much impact that will have in the shaping of the future. I'm not saying that others are getting too old, but that's a fact. We're making more babies than any other places in the world, and that's actually an asset that's probably worth more than even the riches that we can find in the grounds of Africa.
Nice. Yeah, I like this. I like this. And so, Etienne, I wanted to ask you from your perspective as the representative of French investors in Africa. You know, there were a lot of things happening this year in Africa in regards to not wanting to keep these strong ties with France, you know, as we've seen in Niger or in Mali. Do you feel like this is a trend that's going to last, or do you feel like this is a trend that's going to negatively impact Africa?
Thank you very much, and hello to everyone. I'm very happy to be there, especially because, if I understand well, I am the only Francophone speaker here, and I'm the only representing Europe. in France. So thank you very much to welcome me. Et un petit signe amical à nos amis francophones. Bonjour à vous, mais on va continuer en anglais quand même. Yes, I think I represent the French private sector and the French companies invested in Africa, which are huge, maybe as you know. For example,
could you tell us how huge? Do you have a number?
Yes, I have one, yes. The turnover of the members of CIAN, which represents approximately 80% of the French investment in Africa, amounts to 60 billion euro per year, which is huge, and more than 1 million employees and 10,000 plants in the continent. So it's very important. And it shows the importance of Africa for the French economy and the French private sector. And I am also the president of the same organization for Europe. So what I would like to say to start is that the fight against poverty, the development of the continent, will come from the private sector and from the companies. Who creates jobs? Who pays taxes? Who rent and operate services and goods? The private sector. So we have to encourage the private sector to invest in Africa. And the problem is that today, presently, the situation is not very much favorable. There is a kind of tension from the view of the the European private sector, due to the international situation, the wars, due to the increase of the prices of commodities, due to the difficulties to getting cash and a lot of situations. So our job, I think, and it is very important, maybe it could, you may think that it is a bit general, but it's very important, is first to create a desire for Africa. Yes, all the companies, you have to invest in Africa. You have very rightly explained that there will be a huge consumers, a huge number of consumers, and Africa is the future. We think that. But we have to convince the investors to do that. So we have to explain them that there is a huge potential. Secondly, we have to increase the confidence in Africa. It is not high enough, the confidence in Africa. And for that, we have to battle for a favorable and positive business climate, to increase the rule of laws. You see, when a company invests in Africa and is afraid to have a kind of fiscal or tax harassment, it is not a good idea. So we have to explain that it is not worse in Africa than elsewhere. And also, I am very keen to try to de-risk. I don't know if you get this word in English, but in France, we dérisquer l'Afrique. We kind to say that Africa is no more risky than elsewhere in the world, not at all. But we have to convince that. It's very important. And the last point, which is not very much in favor of investors in Africa, is the question of compliance. I suppose that you know, but living in Europe, I know exactly what is on our shoulders in Europe. There are a lot of regulations, rules, procedures, directives on compliance, which is very useful, and we are totally and fully in agreement with that. But sometimes it creates a kind of, they are afraid of their reputation. They see a risk of, for example, a network reputation. So, yes, we have to create a favorable framework to invest in Africa. But I have, after that, but I will let the word after that, I have a very proactive and concrete propositions.
Okay, okay. So you mean you have to basically convince the French or European companies that Africa is not as risky as they think, and kind of change perspectives. So I'm gonna ask Mr. Metiku, the previous senior advisor of the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. I think that the biggest investor in Ethiopia is China, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so how do you think that this trend of, Chinese investors, I think, am I right or wrong? Okay, okay. Okay, so you can comment, but basically my question was: is that a good positive trend or negative trend?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I had the privilege of working in the public service as a senior minister, as former mayor of Addis Ababa, as special advisor to Prime Minister for about 30 years. And I'm also a British Academy Global Professor. And we have been researching on Africa's economic growth. And we may start from the broader picture. Africa in the last 23 years, on average, has grown 4.2% for the last over 2 decades. And the global average growth rate has been about 3%. So much higher than the average growth, but too small compared with the most dynamic region, Asia, where growth and investment is moving faster. So for economic transformation to be sustained, it has to be about 7 or 8% for 3 decades, for a longer period to make a difference. So this is a key point we need to see. And moderator also highlighted about this 800 new workforce to join the existing workforce, which means we have to create 30 million jobs every single year. So this is a key issue. If we have to discuss this matter, if we have to talk about emerging Africa, we have to look at this fundamental issue. And this brings us to the point of relevance of investment. I would like to highlight the importance of investment, not per se general investment or FDI, but productive FDI. And I would like to relate this point to the question that has been raised by Ms. Moderator. Ognia, yeah, thank you. So Ethiopia, I mean, the average growth rate Africa has been about 4%, but Ethiopia has been growing for 15 years on annually average of 10.5%. And before that, average 5.5% for 10 years. So this is twice Africa's average. And in terms of average life expectancy, the growth was also twice Africa's average. It was high growth. One key lesson in this process was the importance of productive investment. The total investment of Chinese FDI, by the way, in the whole continent, was only 49 billion in the last 23 years. $43 billion. And in Ethiopia's last 10 years, especially from 2012, for instance, up to 2022, Ethiopia has been able to attract $30 billion of FDI, and 70% has been in manufacturing. And in order to do this, a lot of intervention was required. Reforming investment processes, coming up with new incentives, expansion of industrial parks and creating ecosystem. And here I want to relate with what is happening in Morocco. Morocco is one of the brightest places in this continent. In the last a decade and a half or 2 decades, it has been successful in building an ecosystem for a globally competitive automotive industry. So this brings us to the issue, how can we create massive jobs? How can we attract massive productive investment in a global situation where FDI size is gradually diminishing at global size? Because in 2007, total global FDI was about 2 trillion, and last year it was only 1.3 trillion. So which means we have to do more, we have to maximize effort to create more jobs, to expand and attract also FDI.
So is China not the first investor? Because I didn't hear
China, if I could give you the exact figure, the figure itself, 49 billion, is indicative. 49 billion in 54 countries in a period of 23 years. So according to studies, China is among the top 4 or 5 investors, following France, UK, and the US and Gulf. In Ethiopia, it's about 18% of Chinese have share in the FDI inflow, but in many sectors, the dominance is not quite distinct. For instance, in brewery industry, the fastest growing brewery industry is in Ethiopia, growing at 25% a year. And here it's entirely dominated by European producers, Castel, Diageo, Heineken, all brands in Europe. In horticulture, it's entirely dominated by Europeans, about 50% Dutch. In cement, it's distributed. Chinese, Dangote.
Yeah, I was going to say it should be Nigeria because, you know, they have Dangote.
Yeah, so what I want to say is the issue about Chinese investment is highly exaggerated. But I have to say, where the Chinese invest in Ethiopia is primarily in manufacturing. McKinsey did a study in 2017. And according to that survey, there were 10,000 Chinese firms in Africa. And out of which 30% were only 30% in manufacturing. While in Ethiopia, about 67% of Chinese firms were in manufacturing. So the focus on industrial policy, the focus on manufacturing, on productive investment was a key component, and that contributed to develop manufacturing sector. And my position is Africa should do more to attract Chinese manufacturing investment, because 27% of global manufacturing is concentrated in China. If you want to learn a piano, you go to the pianist. So manufacturing is concentrated in China, and now because of increased labor cost, it's moving out to Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, and other places. And the more we focus on it, we can create jobs, because again, the challenge is how do we create 30 million jobs every year? And the key focus has to be manufacturing, because manufacturing creates indirect jobs. Elon Musk, in an interview, was mentioning about manufacturing. His factory in Texas created 10,000 jobs. And he said the indirect jobs were 50,000. So the main reason that I want to focus on manufacturing investment, productive investment, is because we need to create jobs, and this is a time bomb. If we don't create jobs for the youth, the aspiration will be pessimism.
Yeah, I completely agree. So for you, yeah, we can clap for this. It's very good. So I kind of agree with what you said. We definitely need manufacturing, but I've always been a pro digital economy. I feel like that's also kind of the future for Africa, and I think Tosin would agree. And I think also Nigeria is very well positioned in terms of the digital economy. The biggest fintechs in Africa are in Nigeria. There's a huge startup ecosystem. I feel like that's a trend that I would like to explore more in this panel. So you can please tell us more.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to MEDays for putting this forum together. And I think one of the ways we can definitely solve Africa's issues is by bringing all of us together to really talk about what the way forward is. To your question around digital, I think for us as an advisory firm and the work we're doing in different African countries, we look at it as digital public infrastructure, DPI. So the first thing you need to look at is how do you integrate technology standards and policies into governance? And then when you bring it into governance, how does that cascade down to even how the civil service uses digital services? So I'll give you one good example. In one state called Edo State, Nigeria, one of the things we have been doing is to really try to improve what they call the digital culture in there. Because we feel like there have been these bottlenecks that obviously that different participants have been talking about. But one of the missing elements is the use of technology to drive productivity, increase efficiency, and then tie it down to the last mile. In most cases, we don't even have the data saying how many people are even in the vulnerable population in some cases, in some African countries, if you ask a question and say, how many vulnerable people or underserved people in this community, the fact is most people don't even know. Why? Because there's no data. Or the data is extrapolated based on 2014, 2015 statistics, and so we don't have accurate data. So one of the big things that we're looking at and we're working on is around digital public infrastructure. The second thing I wanted to say, just to correspond to what everyone has said, is that Africa has now become one huge regional market. Right, so with all the supply chain disruptions going on globally, people are looking for where can we produce more for less. And I believe Africa offers that landscape that you can definitely do that. So Africa should be seen as one regional market, but not Africa as, you know how people use the word Africa. Break it into 4 quadrants: North Africa, South Africa, East Africa, and West Africa. So let's get specific, because all the different cultures are different. The culture in Angola is different from the culture in Nigeria, different culture in Gabon, different the culture in Ethiopia, and different even South Africa. So we have to look at it from that point of view. The third thing I wanted to say is that you know, me and my brother Solomon were just talking about that, laughing, because we actually spoke together last year. And we sat next to each other, and we're sitting next to each other again the following year. You know, and one of the things we talked about was the fact that it needs to be more regional integration. We're not seeing a lot of regional integration. So I like how you used the Lobito corridor. We actually laughed when you said that, because we had it in our notes too about the Lobito corridor. So around Angola, DRC, Zambia, how do we encourage more regional integration among our African countries? Because when we actually do more, you find out that it will speed up productivity, it will reduce the transportation costs. Because anyone coming into the African climate to do business in Africa is looking at, how do I minimize my cost, but how do I get the greatest value out of it? So I think for us as ones that pretty much talk to a lot of investors and those who are worried about the risk, even regulatory risk, one of the things we're trying to help them think through is, what countries should you really pretty much build a base in? What countries offers the best opportunities for regional integration? Which ones have the most promising human capital that you can tap into? Like Morocco is fantastic in the sense of human capital. This is my 4th time in Morocco. And one thing I've enjoyed is the fact that from the culture, from the people, to even the ease of doing business, it's much easier to do business here in Morocco. So, and we're seeing that in places like Morocco. We're seeing also, the last thing I want to say is, we're also seeing renewed tourism. You talked about sectors. We're also seeing renewed tourism in Morocco, renewed tourism in Tanzania. We're also seeing renewed tourism in South Africa. These are all things that people are looking at in terms of how to bring back investments into the African fold. So these are just the points I wanted to make. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, but I feel like tourism is a very volatile sector, and we can see right now with what's happening, the war and all that, people aren't traveling to like Egypt, for example, although there's nothing there. So, but okay, we'll keep tourism for you. So I'm gonna circle back to the initial question of this panel, which is really to identify the key regulations or the things that we can do to improve. Etienne, you said that you did have solutions that you prepared. So this is going to be the next round. Yes.
Since the panel is sought with such a
diverse exactly.
and prodigious and very high intellect, for us that are a little bit curious, can I skip my turn to speak and ask 3 questions that maybe...
You can definitely do that. Please do.
So, no, because it's very, very important to me. So, starting, for example, with what you were talking about and what Mr. Enriquez was talking about, how, for example, does a project like Lobito integrating into DRC with cross-country exchange on electricity, under which frameworks does that work and how easy is it? I know that there was one successful example with the Tanzania-Zambia Railway Common Authority, but I would like to ask those questions on how feasible is it, and then do national egos sometimes step into the way of allowing somebody to do, because we see all over West Africa so many ports being built that are underutilized. I think it's 24 ports, yeah, that have been built that are underutilized. Why not this common strategy? That was one question. My other question was for Professor. When you talk about manufacturing as a solution, and maybe you can answer that from your expertise on digital. I'm looking, and this is just a story of a shock that I had. I was advising a client of mine that's building textile manufacturing in Benin and Togo, and major investments, and we went to go, well, I've seen the videos, they went to go visit factories in Vietnam and so on, and that same manufacturing plant 20 years ago would create about 2,000 to 3,000 jobs, but now with AI, automation, robotization, I think the whole plant runs on 6 people. So again, as a young African, I feel that Africa is being deprived of its opportunity for this industrial revolution phase. And you look at now all the different, I was at the Qingdao port in China. We all invest in infrastructure and logistics, saying that we're going to build corridors. Qingdao port, I think, runs with 6 people, and it's the 6th largest port in the world. All automated cars, automated so on. So what is the solution for the African youth when we say that manufacturing or productive investments will generate employment when technology is again making us skip our opportunity to nearshore or friendshore or offshore? Thank you.
Yeah, you raised a very important question. Actually, let's look what the US is doing now. The Inflation Reduction Act, currently promoted by Biden, President Biden, entirely focuses on technology and manufacturing. And this is the very reason is that you cannot be a leader in technology if you don't have an industrial capacity that can match with the R&D, with the technological capability. So in all manufacturing sectors, there are new technologies coming and promoted, including apparel and textile. Apparel and textile, it's a big market. It's $1 trillion size market. You cannot drop it because technology is moving. What you need to understand is to understand where the technology is making progress and tapping that potential. Even currently, it employs over 100 million worldwide. So the key challenge we need to see is if we don't have manufacturing as a propeller of the economy, we are not going to adequately create jobs in digital economy, for instance. It employs a little proportion, but it's absolutely important for manufacturing as well. And all countries that have focused so far on innovation and technology, including from Asia, a key lesson they raise it. We can take an example of Singapore. Singapore has the biggest international financial platform in Asia, the largest investor, and it invests in innovation. It has small population. And their current policy is that manufacturing should be able to generate 25% of the GDP, even now. And the main reason they say is if manufacturing is not maintained at some level of growth rate, it will not be possible for services to grow because the services sector linked with logistics, shipping, finance, digital, all are linked with the movement of goods, production of goods.
Toisin, do you agree with this? Because I feel like you really want to say something.
Oh, no, I'm listening.
Yeah, so this is the first point. On services sector, we need to understand that we cannot create adequate jobs only in manufacturing. We need also to focus in services. Then the key issue is, do we need to create and encourage informal sector? Small trading, or we need to focus on priority services sector. So in services sector, the priority should be on high productivity activities. For instance, in Ethiopia, aviation is a priority. It generates $6 billion from the export of these services. And also tourism. Tourism is absolutely important. There is no any sector which is insulated from shock. But tourism generates foreign exchange, creates maximum jobs, and we could see this from Morocco as well. And then we have to look at technology, startups. So within services, we need to identify where there is high growth potential.
Feel free to jump in. You don't need to ask me.
Great. Thanks. I think that there's three things I would say. One is it's really easy to be distracted by the kind of the old way of the West is where the demand is, and how do we manufacture to fulfill the needs of the West? And clearly, nearshoring is helping. You know, like the crisis with regard to just international risks, the suspicion between America and China, that's perpetuating supply lines to move. COVID was a really big lesson for world trade with regard to how do you manage your supply chains, you know, all that issue with regard to PPE from Europe, all being manufactured in Far East. Wake up call to Europe, let's do more of that manufacturing locally, and locally can be Morocco, it can be North Africa as well as on European shores. So I think there's been definitely a movement in that argument. Two, as we've mentioned, we have 25–30% of the world's population on this continent by 2050. We've got a 3 billion forecast with regard to consumer expenditure. Africans are going to buy and consume more things manufactured in Africa. So I would absolutely agree, if we can encourage more of those small, medium-sized enterprises that really understand the needs of their local market and grow from that local market. And I absolutely take the point, let's not just look at one country, but look at how you can regionally do that. And if I can encourage a company in Senegal to then start exporting around West Africa, that's what we should be doing. But things like exchange controls, withholding tax, access to visas, these things are barriers. These things are what slow us down. And then my final point on manufacturing, just to give you a good example of where technology is not always the best. My understanding in Nigeria is that the Nestle factory there is very manually operated. It doesn't have the same technology that Nestle has globally. But if you sit down and talk to the management team at the plant, they'll say to you, actually, it's really flexible. We can literally on a Friday make a decision on a Monday what we're going to manufacture. We can retool over the weekend, and we can come out with a new product line on a Monday morning. They can't do that in other manufacturing plants. So sometimes our capacity to be creative, make a plan, do things a bit differently in Africa, I would love to release that, because I think that's where our potential is. It's not about beating the rest with regard to what they're already doing. It's doing more of what Africa is really, really well, and exporting that expertise and that strength and that entrepreneurial spirit.
To other African countries, you mean? Nice, nice. And Liban, you asked Antonio a question that I really liked about this like war of egos in between countries when you want to have a corridor or a trans-country project.
Yes, actually, that was a very good question, because sometimes in life, other than replicating things, probably on your cost, you should probably go on a path of collaborative so that you mitigate both the risks and the cost of a project. So this is the kind of approach that we have managed to put in place with DRC and Zambia through the Lobito corridor, where the cost of the infrastructure and the investment that was made by all the countries is divided proportionally, so that we can then take full advantage of the benefits. That's once. But besides that, it's also important to highlight that there was a need to harmonize regulations so that we are not divergent in that sense, so that we kind of find and judge the different situations that we run when implementing a project in similar ways, to avoid bureaucracy, which is also endemic sometimes and needs to be cut completely as an objective. But of course it will take time, and we need to change our mindsets in a way that instead of being egocentrics, that we start to see on the gains that can be achieved. We are still on a path to achieve that. It's not conclusive yet, but I strongly believe that in order to compete, we'll also have to adopt those ways of doing business, and at the national levels, which is also important, because Angola has been doing a lot in a sense of having a more friendly investment environment where not only from the government side, because populations also, we need also to give our own contributions in assessing how strategic that can be. So overall, I think promoting policies that do boost the growth of industries of manufacturing, as Professor said. I'll call you Professor because you have made your really a difference point in the way you present your views, so that the services will be also in place, and that will generate a completely different dynamics. I will also highlight the importance of connectivity. We have noticed that flying across the continent is not that easy, and sometimes you need to have, when you look at the distance between Angola and Zambia, which is by air 1 hour, you need to fly over to South Africa 3 hours down, and another 3 hours up to reach a distance that's even by car you could be doing it just the way it happens from Casablanca to Tangier. Overall, we still have a lot to do, but just the fact that at the highest levels we have the commitment of the leaderships to achieve that, it's a very good sign that there is commitment. Commitment is very key, and I hope that through that commitment, results will come. Thank you.
Thanks for that example. I was actually going to use a small story to add to what you just said. It took me 5 hours, I think about 5 hours to get from Lagos to Casablanca. It took me roughly close to, I want to say, almost 18 hours to get to Botswana. So that means somebody who is flying to New Delhi will get to New Delhi in India faster than I got to Botswana. So it just shows you some of the connectivity gaps we even have within Africa. The second thing I want to mention is manufacturing. The manufacturing, as you mentioned earlier, is not manufacturing of 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. When we use the word manufacturing, the whole dynamics has changed. And so even from the FMCG, which is a fast-moving consumer goods landscape, and what we see across Africa is the fact that you need to think about how do you begin to bring some new elements in around even climate change adoption. So you can't use the same equipment as 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It might be cheaper, but it's not environmentally friendly. So the long-term effects, we go into the topic of today, it defeats the long-term effects because it might be cheaper in the short run, but in the long term, you pay for it from a health point of view and then from an environmental point of view. So I think the first thing is to look at what does manufacturing mean and even qualify manufacturing of today and tomorrow and make sure that we're clear on that. The second thing I wanted to say was that when you look at the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement, right, that is meant to drive a regional integration across Africa. To the point about egos, which you mentioned, right, this is where, how do you remove those trade and non-trade tariffs that happen across trade corridors? If I'm going from DRC to Zambia or maybe Nigeria to Benin, the number of toll gates, legal and illegal toll gates, are part of the issue.
Or just here with Algeria, the border is closed. So.
Yeah, exactly. Just here with Algeria, thank you, border is closed. I recall this because when we tried to do a program with in Morocco here 2 years ago, and we asked which countries would not be part of it, Morocco was clear about the countries they don't want to be part of it, and they were just around the borders. So these are some sort of things we have to look at, even from that point of view of the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement. How do we make sure that it lines up to the AU 2060 vision, 2063 vision of what Africa should be in 2063? And then coming down to today of the trade barriers, the trade tariffs, the non-trade tariffs, the rule of governance around this. How do we make sure that we reduce those bottlenecks? Because if not, these are the fundamentals. If like I said, if I travel today in my car, I know how many legal toll gates I'm going to get on the road. And these are part of the governance issues that we have to get, because guess what? It's not us who are flying on business class or economy. It's most of our populists who live and whose major mode of transportation is by road that go through a lot of these bottlenecks. So I think we need to think about resolving that and then qualify what manufacturing truly means. Over.
Sorry, I just want to add something on top that Omnia mentioned, is the role of technology. I think that technology will be key for us to leapfrog. And on top of that, also the fact that there is a lot of data out there that now we are not able to collect, the true technology, especially now that we see AI as the main thing, definitely that will enable us to faster achieve our goals. And of course, the youth plays an important role in that aspect.
Actually, I'm a little bit more scared. My question was not fully answered, so I'm going to repeat it with a second layer. Because from my understanding, Professor, the theories are that manufacturing creates blue-collar jobs. These blue-collar jobs structure society at the family level. People can support their children to get to white-collar jobs eventually, and that's how China progressed from, middle class and so on. This is the general things that we are taught. And now we're saying that manufacturing will not create the same jobs to fill those 30 million, but everything around manufacturing or technology within manufacturing or services to manufacturing or inter-regional trade because of selling what we manufacture through digital means or border or through small enterprise, so on. But that means that the quality of training that economy benefited from when there was just manufacturing and you didn't need particular qualifications and you just created wealth and you raised the standards of your country to another is something that we're missing. How are we going to meet these jobs? Because then you need electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, you need that, and these are the new jobs that are created. Are those jobs going to go to African youth, and what are we going to do about it? Like, it even scares me more. So, and maybe you can answer that, because I feel like, again, I'm very scared like we're going to miss a pivotal moment.
Yeah, you raise a very absolutely important point. When we talk about manufacturing, the first thing we need to understand, let's talk about our industrialization. The industrialization concept covers elements of services, elements of also modern agriculture. And the main reason I'm saying is, let's look, our leaders went to Moscow to beg food during this Ukraine war.
What? Are you sure about this?
Yeah, this was, the African Union delegation headed by President Ramaphosa went to Ukraine and Russia to allow wheat dispatch from these countries. This brings us to the big question. Why should Africa forget agriculture, a continent that has 60% of arable land, world's arable land, and the very, very basic necessity for Africans is food. So this brings us to the issue that we need to prioritize food security. Second, if we have to seriously think about jobs, we have to do everything to generate jobs, but we also need to identify sectors that have multiple effects, that have spillover effect to encourage more additional jobs. So this is where industrialization becomes critical. Then technology is absolutely important for all sectors. Education is changing. The first transition should come. One good example I would like to present in Morocco is we know this King Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. It was recently established, but I consider it as symbolic because the main focus is to build university like Stanford and MIT on technology side. So one major shift African countries should focus is to move from social sciences, humanities, dominated education system, universities, towards technology and engineering dominated education system. But within this also the content is changing. The programming teaching given in ICT 20 years back is no more valid. The content is changing. So this is a very dynamic process, and investing in human capital to ensure that the education systems is linked to job creation, is linked to technological advancement is going to be absolutely important. And here,
yes, thank you very much. But I also feel like, and Toisin would know a lot about this, the way young people learn today is much different than before. information is free online and people can access it, you know, at their fingertips. And with AI and ChatGPT, I think you can learn so many digital skills very easily and quickly. So Etienne, please, I really need to hear from you because there is a lot of stuff that's been discussed here.
Thank you, Mia. 2 or 3 points. First, only to confirm what Professor said, I confirm that yet China has not taken over and dominating Africa. Yes, in investment stock in the continent.
From which perspective, though? Because
no, but it's very important
to explain that.
To push our investors to invest in Africa, to say, yeah, we are still there, and we can do it by partnerships with local interests and local companies. So I would like to raise, I agree with all was said, and especially on the manufacturing sector, but I would like to raise 2 points which are still very important and which can be a difficulty for private investors. The first one is the access to financing. We can do everything, we can sing all old principles, but if it's very difficult to get money to invest on a project, there will be nothing. And secondly, once you get the money, if you can get it, when the price of your loan is so high that it kills your project, end of the story. How can you manage a project when you borrow at 15, 16% a year? It means that you need to have a project at a return on investment of 25, 26. It doesn't exist. And if it does, you are no longer competitive with other competitors. So it's a huge problem. And I have 1 or 2 ideas on that, not very news, but the first one is that the one answer could be to deliver much more easily guarantees. Once you have a solid guarantee from a DFI, from a bank, from the states, from somebody else, you can get the money and at a lower price. So I think that one big target for the DFIs could be or would be to deliver huge guarantees. That's the first idea. The second idea is that I advocate for the increase of stock exchange in Africa. There is not enough liquidity on investment. When you are an investor, you invest in a company, but you are always asking the question, what will I do with my investment within 7 or 10 years? Will I be stuck with that, or can I sell it or get out or exit? And so the answer is the stock exchange. So I think together we have, I think, to increase the role of the stock exchange. There are several stock exchanges in the continent, but they are not very strong, honestly, not very large. That's the second idea. Now, that was my first point. Second point is regarding the manufacturing and the creating added value system. I think we have to be totally clear. If manufacturing is not very much developed, it is, but not very much in Africa, in my view, there is one reason for that. It is in the world competition, it is because Africa economies are not yet enough competitive. We have a problem of competitiveness in Africa economies. I give you examples. When you have not the access to electricity, when you have not the access to water, except 12, 15, 17 years hours per year or per day, sorry, it's a little bit difficult to be competitive. How can you be competitive when it's difficult to get clever staff and manpower? So that is the answer is, of course, the vocational education, which is not yet enough developed. So I think we have to work together on the competitiveness of African economies. And I have 2 or 3 other ideas on that, but it should be our common target before maybe, because we can speak of digital, of corridors and so on, but once you have not those 2 conditions, financing and competitiveness, we cannot get your objective.
Ike, I fully agree with you with regard to access to debt. And quite often when you go to what we refer to as development banks, the terms and conditions of those facilities are not that dissimilar to what commercial facilities are. Maybe there should be a greater emphasis put on the wider impact, employment creation, environmental benefits of those investments. And that should, to your point, then means the guarantee structure and the tenure of those debts terms could be improved. But also, I throw a point back to you. What about the European Union? You know, European Union is a closed shop. And when we had issues with regard to the UK leaving Europe, there was a big conversation in Africa about, great, we can now access the UK market with regard to our agricultural produce, where previously it was very difficult to get into the EU. You know, can the EU not do more with regard to intertrade within Africa to encourage our growth, rather than sending us donations, let's do more business together? And then before I hand back, tourism's come up multiple times. Absolutely fully agree that it's a big impact sector, particularly with regard to accessibility. You know, it's one industry, I know I'm in it, but genuinely within that industry, there is real development of people. There's sharing of skills. There's the capacity to learn international standards and access. The fact that you can work in your local business, which is running the same systems, procedures, practices as other tourism opportunities somewhere else in the world, that gives you the opportunity to go and fulfill those roles. But I also think we've got a big challenge, and it was mentioned with regard to Akibira's points about manufacturing and agricultural and food safety. One of the biggest challenges we have in Africa is land. We have an emotional attachment to land. It's inbuilt within us with regard to how families value their own wealth. Quite often it's related to land. So how do we structure that differently so that when people move from rural areas into urbanization, which is obviously the trend within the continent, we need to make sure that's not seen as disadvantaging you with regard to the value of the land. How can you then change that land structure so that you can then do genuine commercial agricultural produce productivity? And what I've seen in data terms is that we're allowing now local farmers who may well be 5-8 hours from a market having access to what's the right pesticides to use. How can I sell my produce? How can I commercialize my land? That's where I think there's another big advantage in digital terms.
Okay, I just wanted to jump in talking about, the digitization of the country, of the economy, right? I was looking at some numbers, and 40% of what India generates as its income from digital skills is actually what is the size of Nigeria's GDP. Right? So the question is, we have this capital that everybody talks about, like in terms of people, but are they human capital? Is it an asset to us? How do we develop that skill that we can then be able to position ourselves where we can generate foreign exchange income and be able to thrive on that? Now, why is this important? We're talking a lot about trade. Let me give you an example. If somebody had invested in Nigeria at 360 naira to the dollar, which was the exchange rate about 2 years ago, that person would have need to make about 100% return on their investment in Nigeria if they're going to exit in order to make some kind of profit. This is the role of currency depreciation. So if we're talking about trade, who wants to come into a country where they're afraid that the profit they will make will be eroded by currency depreciation? So we're looking at what can we do to earn more in foreign exchange, and exportation of digital skills is one of those ways. So again, this is where majority of our followers and our members are people under the ages of 35, and they form about 70% of our population. So how do we build that skill so that they can go out and import foreign exchange in the form of skills? So digital economy is here to stay, and we have to be very intentional about growing it on the continent. Thank you.
Yeah, very well said. Great. Okay, so we're reaching the end of this panel discussion before we give the floor to the public for questions. So yeah, I just want to do a last round to see if you have any concrete solutions that you would like to share. And please keep it 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, I have some. maybe
Go ahead.
to be very concrete, I think we have ways to operate, and my proposals are the following, very shortly. First, I think we have to promote and to give the advantage to the PPPs as a method, private-public partnership. I think it's a very useful and very successful method. First idea. Second idea, we have, mainly the states, have to promote much more the call to project than the call to program. In my mouth, that means that the states should call the projects in the pockets of the private sector. We have a lot of projects, of ideas, and we should be called by the states to provide our ideas and be financed by the states. So the call, in other terms, it's a new cooperation between public and private sector. Third idea, I think we need to increase the size of the African markets. The size of the markets, when you see there are 54 countries, and when you see the size of the markets, a lot of, not all, but a lot of them are small, are too small. And it's difficult to amortize an investment on a small market. So the fact to increase the size of the market is very important. And the answer is the African Free Zone Agreement, which is in which we are totally in favor of, and we are waiting that it will become effective. There is another answer also, which are the special economic zone. You know that? It's not so bad. There are special tax and fiscal arrangement, and it's very important to increase the competitiveness of the countries. And the last point, will be the last, I advocate a lot to simplify the procedures. When you are an international investor...
It's good that you say this as a French person, because the French system is very bureaucratic.
Yes, but Europe as well. Europe as well. But also the World Bank.
That's true.
No, the system is very bureaucratic, and it's a race against time. So now we have no time to waste time in 3, 4, 5 years in bureaucracy. So we have together to have this fight against bureaucracy.
Well, I would just say that to me it's unthinkable to look at the size of the informality of our economies without approaching that same informality into a more formal environment without technology. So leapfrogging, and I insist on that, in a country like mine where close to 70% or 80% of the economy is informal, so that means that the real GDP it's being handled by all those people that are outside the ecosystem that need to bring to brought in. And of course, by finding solutions that can only be connected with the technology, there's no way we can do besides the role of the governments, besides of the role of policies. Without technology, we're never going to be able to make that happen. So I think it's key to more and more move into connectivity, affordable, let's say, social services, and also platforms like the ones that have been related to fintech, financial inclusion, and so on, into that space. And if we achieve that, there's a massive potential even in revenues streams that are sitting there, in capital that's there outside of the systems to boost all other sectors of the economy. I think that's the way, and myself and my company, we are committed into making a solution that has this Pan-African reach so that we give our own contribution in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the points you highlighted from the perspective of the private sector. The concrete ideas I would suggest is, again, Africa should focus on quality of economic growth, quality of transformation and investment. And here the implication is, first now, We are in a changing global environment. Greening of economy, carbon neutrality is becoming prominent. So whatever investment is made and whatever industrial capacity we need to build now, we have to target and focus that we are building a clean industrial capacity, not to be dumped later on. For instance, automotive sector in Morocco, if it's going to continue producing for 10 years internally combustible engines, it's going to be forbidden in European Union by 2035. So this is a key point on greenery, carbon neutrality. We need to have to focus. And this is not idealist. Ethiopia currently entirely focuses on renewable energy, 100%, hydro and wind. The second point I want to highlight is African governments do not have adequate resources. They have to play with shortage and deficit of resources. So here, choices have to be made. There are areas to be forgotten or put as secondary priority. So here I would like to focus that government should focus on building energy sector, because without energy, we cannot think of small business, we cannot think of restaurant, we cannot think of other economic activity to continue. And here, the modalities will be quite different from private sector investment to PPP to also financed by government. The third point is focusing on industrial hubs, industrial parks, or special economic zones, whatever the name. And here again, I want to point to what has happened in Morocco. Morocco would not have succeeded to build an automotive industry if the Tanger made hub or complex was not built, if logistics hubs, if industrial zones were not developed, not only in Tanger, but also Rabat and Casablanca. So this helps for the government to prepare, to provide government services, quality government services, one-stop services inside the park, and also make sure that the required incentives are given. So this is one way to cope with resources shortage, but also to prioritize policy advices. On AFCFTA, I want to highlight 2 points.
We have to keep it short, though. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
so
intra-Africa, I'm just done. The intra-African trade is, we have to be aware, is minimal. It's 17% of all African trade. The remaining 83% is international trade, with remaining the globe. But Africa's share in global trade is only 3%. So here we need to work at 2 levels. How do we expand Africa's share in international trade? And also, how do we address the AFCFTA economic integration is going to be an important issue. And here, connectivity is going to play an important role, including ports.
Okay, but you did mention something about Morocco and the automotive industry and the environment. But I think during the last climate summit that was in Egypt last year, they had this agreement on carbon financing that they were supposed to get from the EU, and that has not happened. So how is Africa expected to cope or, you know, abide with the environmental standards of Europe without getting any financing for it? But this is not a panel on environment, but that's my personal take on it. I don't like when we're telling African countries that, you know, you have to now all of a sudden have these environmental standards, but we're not going to give you any money for it.
Sorry, the story of the automotive production in Morocco is a good example of the possibility and the necessity to be competitive in the world. Morocco is a competitive economy, and now they can, and you can battle against Chinese, European, and American producers. That is the key. And a lot of other African countries are not yet competitive. And the key is a good produced locally cheaper than the same good imported? That's the answer. That's the question.
True. Thank you. Okay.
So, talking about trade and investment, even from a personal perspective, it's looking at the cost of food. So, if you look at the statistics, the average Nigerian spends over 50% of their income on food, and the food is like really expensive. What can we do to drive down those costs? Are there other countries that are competitive that we can actually trade amongst ourselves in order to make it cheaper? There was a point in Nigeria where the borders were closed for over 2 years, stopping cheaper food from coming in from neighboring countries at the cost of the citizens themselves. So how can we make food cheaper? Now, why is this important? This frees up the income of the people, and that way this residual income can be used to trade, it can be used to migrate, it can be used to do other things. So it's very, very important that we are also looking at the income in the hands of people. Now, the other one as well is the currency risk. Currency risk is such a big deal. You're now seeing a lot of young people looking for how to invest in hard currency, right? Looking for how to invest outside of Africa because they are scared of their purchasing power depletion when they hit retirement. Now, how do you secure that for them? How do you make the continent attractive? That way, the limited resources is not invested outside of the continent and that we lose that capital. So those are the things that I'm actually looking at in terms of solutions to make the continent attractive, address currency risk, and make food cheaper. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to have a separate conversation about what's happening in Nigeria. I think as an investor, and we're in that market, we really believe that there's reforms are happening. I think the new leadership, the new central bank governor, I think they have a plan. We're hoping that today's huge, material devaluation, we invested at 170 to the dollar, and it's now effectively in the black market at 1100. So you're absolutely right, it's a very difficult position. But I do actually think that the right interventions are happening. I think the right intent is there. I think the removal of some of the subsidies, it's an adjustment. Let's hope it's short-term for long-term gain. If I may, I think there's three positives. I think Renault's investment in Morocco absolutely is a really good example of nearshoring. I believe 17% of Renault's production globally now originates in Morocco. Two, I do think we are unfortunately still going to have traditional automotive cars, petrol-driven cars rather, hydrocarbon-driven cars for the foreseeable. I don't think, as we can talk about globally, there is definitely a lack of an insufficient supply of dependable electricity. So you're still going to have those combustion engine requirements. And Morocco, I think, is positioned well to do both fulfilling that demand as well as increasingly supplying electric vehicles. I think in tourism terms, Morocco has had a phenomenal year. Like Marrakesh has been incredible. We obviously had the devastation of the earthquakes, but that market came back very quickly. In 2022, there was 12 million tourists arrived in Morocco. We've already surpassed that in 2023. So the figures are very encouraging. And then my last piece is, I think with regard to opportunity, is yes, I do think that the free trade agreement for the continent is absolutely where the future needs to be. But we have to ask ourselves, why has that not been ratified yet?
Very good question. Thank you. So I kind of made a mistake. We have 9 minutes left, maximum 10. So I really like this panel because we have so many different perspectives, but I feel like you guys were a bit holding back on some of your opinions. So I hope that you won't be holding back on your last thoughts.
So I think that just to say it, I listened to what everybody had to say as a good student, and I think that they're very well structured, but I think that we are missing out on some of the essential points. So I agree that we have to be competitive. But before we become competitive, we have to go through a phase that we're not allowed to go through as Africans, which is protectionism, because it starts first from protecting our markets by letting ourselves the chance to build our regional and national champions, and from there on create the ecosystems that allow for us to flourish. And I believe that this vision of an economic United States of Africa is actually something that must be by building at the regional levels first. And I do not believe that any competitivity is reached without building value chains. And value chains actually starts by what we have that is our natural competitive advantage, and that's our natural resources. I believe our non-renewable and renewable resources have to be protected, integrated into value chain, captured into special purpose vehicles, financial vehicles, and go raise money wherever capital is available, because that's where it's at. When we talk about the energy transition throughout the world right now, when we look at what you are doing between Angola, DRC, and Zambia, that's where the truth lies. How do we climb up the battery value chain? And how does Africa now become a global player that determines its prices and at what price we access the market, similarly to how the world is being run by OPEC around oil prices and how it works, especially at this moment. I think that as long as we as Africans do not decide to be bold, stop this regional competition that is sometimes influenced by outside advisors, outside actors like the IMF and so on. If we do not make these bold decisions, when we talk about our agriculture, yes, we definitely need to climb up that value chain. It's imperative for self-sufficiency. So for me, I think that this African dream is becoming a reality. There's a new generation of leadership that are making these bold decisions. I believe what Benin and Togo are doing with the cotton processing, deciding that now they will go straight from farm to fashion. That represents about, I think, 42% of global cotton supply between that whole area, between Mali, Niger, and Benin. These are the type of decisions that we need to take, because if we don't take them, Africa misses its opportunity. We've been handed the short stick. We need to leapfrog. Thank you.
Yes, very, very good. Okay, so I'm going to give you 1 minute, but then the first question will be for you. You'll get to answer it.
No worries. So I think I just want to make a few points. I'll try to hopefully do this in a minute. I think number one is that the gender landscape across Africa, one of the key things we're seeing is there has to be a strong women's economic empowerment across Africa, which will evolve into women in leadership. The second is that we need to reduce the cost of production. The reason why part of the issues we're seeing across the board is the cost of production is high. If you reduce the cost of production, it can lead to more efficiency. The third is that you can't ignore healthcare in Africa. We didn't talk about it on the panel, but it's something that happened during the pandemic. But we're able to go through it, but with a resilient nature. But healthcare, we can't really ignore that. And I think the last thing I want to say, the last two things I want to say is a more regulatory and transparent PPP framework is what we're missing. A more transparent and flexible regulatory framework is what we're missing. And the last is use the example from Botswana. Government decided to renew their agreement with De Beers for the mining leases, right? I think every African country needs to study that and begin to look at some of the mining, and especially now that lithium is becoming big, to look at some of the mining leases that we have and really to figure out, are we going to be protected tomorrow from what we currently have now? Because if we don't have that, then I think those discussions should start today for a better tomorrow. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, so now you can ask questions. And the way it's going to work is you just raise your hand and someone will pass a mic or not. And then you can ask your question to anyone you want in this panel. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. So my question is, thank you first of all to the panelists. This has been great. My question is to Monsieur Giros, right? You said that you're working basically to convince French/European investors that Africa is not risky and that it's a safe place, safe haven for investments. But how do you plan on doing that while the very people who created this narrative that Africa is risky are French/European media and politicians? So are you working with them to sort of change this narrative, or like how is that working in the long term? No, I'm very curious. Thank you.
It is a very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, I think we have to create a very positive narrative, and the problem of the risky view of Africa in the spirit and in the mind of the French and European investors is coming largely from us, from our side, I must say. And we have a lack of knowledge of Africa in Europe. We don't know very well Africa, or they don't know very well Africa. And the reality is not corresponding with the risk view they have or the feeling, the risk feeling they have. So yes, it's a permanent battle and a permanent advocacy. We are trying to convince and I must say that, last point, we have also another enemy, opponent, which is a compliance. I am not at all against compliance regulations, not at all. I think it's positive and it could be an advantage in the worldwide competition. But the way these compliance rules and procedures are implemented are not very positive and they are creating risk in the mind of competitors. When you are the president of a European group and you risk to be called by the justice or even to jail because a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary is attacked to have employed children, for example, which is not yet proved, but it is absolutely a destroyer for this company because as the markets are small, sometimes in European groups it represents 2, 3, 4%. And if you feel that the risk by investing in Africa is 20 or 25% of your reputation, you don't go. So we are fighting against that, not against regulation, but against this feeling.
Okay, thank you very much. Who has a question? Yes. She's bringing you a mic.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for sharing your time with us. You have given us really insightful point of views. Now, to my question, it's not really directed at anyone specific, but surely in order to make a country attractive in terms of investment, governments have to invest themselves in infrastructures and others. And in order to do that, most governments will go and collect debt from international associations. Now, when it comes to African countries, we can see the progress in infrastructure, but we shouldn't forget that in parallel, there's debt that's adding up year after year, and what's really the point of investment if our debt will hinder the growth? And my question is, how can we avoid this snowball effect, knowing that especially when we're trying to negotiate as an African country our loan, we don't really have a choice if we see our financial status, and we don't get to choose our investors most of the time if we can't repay our loans. So this was my question.
I think it's a really good question, and you know, I live in South Africa now, but obviously born in Europe, and clearly as the African continent has grown in the last 10 years, 15 years, there has been a gap between expectation of infrastructure and delivery. And we've had a debate about the influence of China. China's seen that opportunity. You know, some of the big infrastructural projects you see, roads in Kenya, airports in Zambia, that's been enabled by China. So China's, through debt, maybe by traditional FDI, has come in and supported those infrastructural projects. I think what I would say is that absolutely it's the role of government to effectively set up investment frameworks, provide the infrastructure, provide the rule of law, provide the access to capital we talked about, but it's also a responsibility of the politicians to make sure that how you structure those financial tools to enable that infrastructure is done in a manner that's sustainable. And that's where I think sometimes the short-termism of politics and the investment thesis of sustainability sometimes are not aligned.
Thank you.
Okay, again, I'd love to use Nigeria as an example. So currently in Nigeria, the revenue the government makes is not even enough to service the recurrent debt, right? So that is the interest on the debt. So what is going to happen here? You keep seeing the debt pile up. Now, there are two ways to go about this. Number one, you could have more responsible spending, right? So that your being more intentional about where the expenses are going into. And number two, you're looking for how to also increase that revenue. If you look at the production of the oil, Nigeria is currently on about 1.3 billion barrels per day, and the OPEC has given us a 1.7 billion barrel per day quota. How do you increase that quota to actually meet what OPEC is, requiring? How do you stop the leakages? So it's like a two-arm. Be more responsible with your spending, grow that revenue, be intentional about cutting that debt. Another thing to also look at is restructuring, right? Is it possible for us to restructure that debt in such a way that, can you renegotiate for the interest options? How do you go back to the debtors and renegotiate, restructure it, be more responsible, and let everybody be on board? And that's one of the reasons why we are doing educating the populace about how the money works, so that we can also hold the government responsible to do the right thing by us. Thank you.
I was going to add something to your question. I think one model that you should definitely look at is the West Africa gas pipeline that Morocco is leading. And because it cuts across different countries across ECOWAS, and a lot of them are not able to afford it. So what they have done is to bring in more multilateral institutions in it. And so you have different countries weighing in, bringing in different level of commitments. And I think they kind of understand, because they've been able to leverage their risk by bringing in more multilateral institutions. So I think the case study I wanted to give to you as an example is the West Africa gas pipeline. So if you look at that, that may be a good example to see how to sort of manage and leverage your risk, especially when you can't afford it, and it might lead to some level of increased debt servicing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Did that answer your question? Very good. We have one more last question here on the right side. The gentleman here, right here. There. Run. No, it's him. It's the gentleman. And then it will be you, if you want. But he did ask first. Sorry.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde.
Ils parlent pas français, donc si vous voulez.
Moi, je parle qu'en français.
Ok, donc vous pouvez me dire ma question et puis je peux la traduire, because or you guys can wear the thing because he doesn't speak English in case you don't understand.
Oui, alors d'abord, je voudrais souhaiter la bienvenue à tout le monde. Je suis Rachid Ouazani. De la société civile du Maroc.
Merci. Merci.
Je souhaite un bon séjour.
Quelle est la question? Parce qu'on n'a plus beaucoup de temps.
Oui, alors ma question, c'est que alors nous, Africains, qui avons vécu il y a longtemps avec les Européens, les Chinois, toutes sortes de nationalités, maintenant que l'Afrique s'éveille, et qu'il veut être un peu indépendante. Est-ce qu'il sera facile à ces pays de laisser l'Afrique s'épanouir, se développer? Je ne pense pas. Ce sera très difficile. Est-ce que c'est une véritable lutte qui va être déclenchée, parce que nous allons trouver toujours des obstacles? Ils ne vont pas nous laisser. Comment laisser une vache qui donne du lait à quelqu'un?
Smart guy.
L'Afrique, c'est une vache. Ils donnent toujours du lait. Et je voudrais que de l'autre côté, qu'ils comprennent que maintenant l'Afrique d'hier, ce n'est pas l'Afrique d'aujourd'hui. C'est une Afrique qui a maintenant ces jeunes qui ont étudié, qui connaissent maintenant l'émancipation, le droit de l'homme, le droit de la femme, bien sûr. Quand on dit l'homme, c'est la femme aussi. Le droit de l'homme, le droit de la femme, le droit de l'enfant, que nous n'avons pas vu ces derniers jours être respecté. Ça, c'est un problème qu'on ne peut pas soulever, mais il est le moment. C'est le moment de donner un peu le mot à l'Afrique, de parler, de s'exprimer, de se développer pour être au niveau de ce
Merci,
qu'il faut
oui,
être.
effectivement. Très bon point, très bon. Après, ok. Ouais,
Je voulais répondre à mon aîné en français, pour dire la réalité, très cher aîné, c'est que nous, vos enfants qui avons étudié, avons compris que ce que l'Afrique attend, le monde l'a déjà vécu. Si on regarde le développement en Europe, aux États-Unis, le sang a coulé, il y a des guerres économiques. Aujourd'hui, quand on parle de polycrise dans le monde, Et quand j'utilisais l'exemple des éléphants qui se battent sur la savane, les éléphants se battent réellement, mais ils se battent entre eux. Il y a une guerre sous-jacente économique entre les États-Unis, l'Europe, la Chine, qui aujourd'hui se joue sur un niveau planétaire. Il faut que nous, Africains, comprenions que le développement économique est une guerre sans précédent. Et tant qu'on ne comprendra pas que le jour où on emmène les chaînes de valeur de nos ressources naturelles sur notre continent, c'est des emplois qu'on est en train d'enlever ailleurs. C'est des devises qu'on est en train d'enlever ailleurs. Tant qu'on ne l'a pas compris, on va toujours aller dans cette guerre comme si on est en train de négocier avec un frère. Rouya, laisse-moi me développer. Non, le développement s'arrache et il s'arrache avec force et vigueur. Et c'est ça la nouvelle Afrique.
Very good, very good. On this note, we have to end this panel. If you have any other questions, just come to me and then we can have a discussion. But thank you very much. We really have to end this. So thank you for being here. And yeah, one last round of applause for the participants. Thank you so much.